Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Rosie and if you are new here, please do subscribe. So in today's video, I'm going to talk you through aperture. Now, I know that when I first started photography, I had no idea how to shoot in manual with aperture, ISO and shutter speed. So I kind of want to try and break this down a little bit and make it super easy to understand and try and teach it how I wish I'd have been taught 5 or 6 years ago. So the first thing to talk about is what is aperture. Now, aperture is a little bit like your eye. So when you step outside into the bright daylight, your pupil closes up and lets less light in there so that you can see. And then when you go into a dark room, your pupils open up to allow more light in there so that you can see the surroundings as well. Now, this is exactly the same with lenses. So the next thing is, how does the aperture change or affect the photograph? Now, the aperture affects the photographs in 2 different ways. The first way is the amount of light that is allowed into the camera and into the lens. And the second way is the amount of depth of field. The depth of field just means how much of the photograph is in focus, whether it's, one person or the whole scenery. How much is in focus, that is the depth of field. Something else to point out is that aperture, f-stop and f-number is all the same thing. Basically, aperture is measured in fractions and that's the number that you see. All you need to know is that aperture, f-stop, f-number, all the same thing. What do the numbers mean? So the main thing to know is that a low number is actually a big aperture. So 1.4 means that the lens is open a lot. f22 means that the lens is open a tiny bit. I'm going to jump into this in a second, but that's the main piece of advice you need to know. The other thing to know is that low numbers such as f1.4, f2, f2.8, these are great for a good bokeh. And bokeh means when the background or the foreground is blurry, but the person or subject or object is in focus. So I'm going to put a chart on the screen here to help you understand a little bit about the f-stop and the numbers and what happens with the photographs. So f1.4 is a very large aperture because the lens is open a lot. So it's a low number with a large aperture. This means that there is a small depth of field, so it means that a tiny bit of the photograph is actually in focus, and it means that because it's wide and because it's open, there is a lot of light coming in there. f2.8 is similar, but then f5.6 is medium aperture because it's halfway open. It means there's a medium depth of field, so maybe half of the photograph is in focus and half of it is blurry with that nice bokeh, and it means that there is a medium amount of light coming in. Now, on the other extreme, f22 is a very small aperture, so it's a big number, but it's a small aperture. This means that the lens is only open a tiny bit. It means there is a very large depth of field, so everything in the photograph is going to be in focus. But it also means there is not a lot of light coming in because it's a tiny hole, it's not open that much, not much light can get in there. If you use a high f-stop number, which is a small aperture, you need to change the ISO and the shutter speed to accommodate for the lack of light coming in from the aperture. On the other side, if you use a 1.4, you need to change the shutter speed and the ISO because there is a lot of light getting into the lens and the camera, so you need to accommodate that with the shutter speed and the ISO. I've just got a different graph here as well to show you. So again, f.2 is a large aperture. It means that the lens is open a lot. f4, it's a little bit smaller. f5.6 a little bit smaller, f8 smaller, f11 smaller, and f16 is smaller. So f16 is a large number, but it's a small aperture. And if we look at the blue scale along the bottom, f2.8 is a shallow depth of field, which means there is not a lot in focus, and f16 is a lot of depth of field, so there's a lot of things in focus. And then along the top it says f2.8 lets more light in, and f16 lets less light in. So something to bear in mind with the numbers. So f1.4 is the maximum aperture and f22 is the minimum aperture. I found this really hard to kind of understand and to make sense of when I was learning because it just kind of didn't make sense that it was the opposite of what you would think. It's just the way it is, you just need to learn it that way basically. But also, so 1.4 can be called shallow because it's a shallow depth of field. It's a large aperture and it's the maximum aperture. And f22 is wide because it's a wide depth of field. It's a small aperture and it's the minimum aperture. And the next graph I want to show you is this one. So as you can see along the top, f22, everything is in focus. F16, the background is a tiny bit out of focus. F11 is a little bit more out of focus. F8 is more, until you get to F1.4, where the person is in focus and the background is completely blurry, you can barely see what it is. This is a great graph to learn about aperture. So you might not know which aperture to use for portraits or for landscapes. I would recommend a low f-stop number, so a high aperture for portraits, and a high f-stop number but a small aperture for landscapes. So I would use an f1.4, f2 or f2.8 for portraits. That way the person, the model, the family, the whatever it is in focus, but the background and the foreground is all blurry. However, if you're going to photograph a landscape, I'd recommend something along f8, f11, f16, so that everything is in focus and you can see the mountains right in the background, you can see the people in the foreground, everything is in focus. So you might be wondering about group photography. If you have to photograph maybe 5 or 6 people together, I'd recommend going with an aperture of around 5.6 or 8. This means that generally, everyone should be in focus. The background might be a tiny bit blurry in the foreground, but generally it should be a really good starting point. However, if you're photographing somebody on their own, a pet, jewellery, food, anything that's kind of an individual item, I'd recommend shooting as high aperture as you can, so a low number, so f1.4, f2, f2.8. These are beautiful for objects, for products, for people, all that kind of good stuff. And if you're shooting groups or if you want a lot of information to be in focus, obviously you need to go for a higher number, which is a lower aperture, so something around f8, f11 would be perfect. So let's have a roundup. What I hope you learned from this video. A low number means that the lens is open a lot, so it's a large aperture. This means that there is a lot of light going in, and it also means that there's only a tiny bit in focus. And on the other side, a high number is a small aperture because it's small and closed. It means there is not a lot of light going in, but that everything is in focus. I really hope I kind of made this a little bit easier. I really hope I didn't make it even more confusing, because I know that it's such a hard thing to understand right at the beginning. If you do have any questions, make sure you leave them below in the comment section. I'll be sure to answer them for you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!